So you've been doing this research for years. Is there one particular thing that you just, anytime you talk about the stuff that never gets brought up, but you just always love talking about?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. No, I guess, one of the things, I guess partly what got me interested in this in the first place was the similarities between the ancient afterlife beliefs and NDEs. And I was kind of looking at this idea of cross-cultural similarity in all these different cultures. And that's what my first book was, which was called Conceptions of the Afterlife in Early Civilizations. And it's actually going to be called Near Death Experience in Ancient Civilizations. So in a couple of years, it's going to be reissued. But basically, so that was interesting, and that was I enjoyed doing that research. But it was really later that the differences stood out to me more and started just kind of in a way capturing my imagination more, as well as the more kind of, I mean, what I've been talking about so far is all pretty um, you know cultural history of religions kind of stuff. But as far as like going into the psychical research and parapsychology stuff, what are the implications for all this stuff on that side of things? What does it mean for the idea that near death experiences are actual experiences of an afterlife, and at the same time, what does it mean for claims that they're just the dying brain and a burst of energy activity at the end of life or whatever? Um, and I think because basically I think my research can be used to support either kind of theory, but in some ways it's a real challenge to the materialist theories, to the idea that it's just the dying brain. Um, for example, there was a recent study, a couple of recent studies. There was that they detected that rats, when they're dying, have this burst of brain activity at the last few moments of death, and then they observed that in a human. They were able to, in just last year, they monitored a person who was dying and confirmed that there's this huge burst of brain activity right when somebody dies. And so they said, so that's probably explains the life review element of an NDE. And there are all these, overblown reports in the media that NDEs have been explained by physical science. Um, but the issue there is that they're only looking at the popular conception, the Western popular conception of Western NDEs. They're not taking into account the fact that life reviews are completely, practically unknown in a lot of the small scale societies, and they're actually quite rare even in the West. So they've taken this like stereotype generality that you'd see in a movie, and they've said, oh, that explains this one element, when that element isn't universal in itself. So, so in other words, they're saying a universal brain-based function explains this universal near-death experience thing, but the near-death experience thing isn't universal to begin with.
Well, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, so you have your replay of life version of a near death experience, or your death experience, if you were, versus the people that visit the afterlife. Well, that's two different trains on two different tracks. And
Right.
if the person comes back and has one without the other, either or, that still doesn't
Yeah.
explain the one.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can't. So any kind of physiological explanation that they've so far come up with isn't holding water. I'm not saying that they won't come up with one that does, but so far they haven't. But then by the same token, you could say that the similarities that do exist cross culturally show that it's some kind of maybe cognitive function of the brain, maybe not a totally physical thing, but just the way our cognitive mechanisms work, and that then it's overlaid with the particular cultural stuff. Like there's a neuroscientist researcher, Jesse Baring, who demonstrated that very, very young children who basically had no religion, and this is in the West, in England and in America, um, that they intuitively believed in an afterlife even before they had even been taught about it. They would give them a puppet show where a lizard puppet is killed by another puppet, and they'd say, what happened to that puppet? And none of them would just say, oh, he's dead and in the ground. They'd say, um, he went to see his mother, or whatever. They would make up some scenario um, to show that that puppet somehow had an afterlife. So for whatever reason, we seem to be intuitively, we're hardwired to believe in an afterlife, which is in itself pretty interesting.
I was going to say, of all the things you've said tonight, I think that one. Maybe. I don't want to downplay the rest of it, but we're 15 minutes in, and that's kind of the first time you've kind of left me go, oh, wait a second.
Yeah, and so then if we're primed to believe in an afterlife, then when people have NDEs and come back, we're sort of primed to accept what they say about it, and accept that what they said, really was an experience of an afterlife.
Which
And the
may,
same goes with mediumship stuff and reincarnation, um, which I also talk about in the new book. Um, it's a similar kind of you know there's an intuitive thing to be open about it, and even skeptical scientists, they wouldn't be researching it and trying to disprove it if they weren't interested in it. So
yeah, you've got to believe enough to want to disprove it that there's something there because you're trying to disprove it, which is always
right,
fascinating
yeah,
to me. Well, it also makes me wonder what children know or believe, or however you want to frame that we kind of learn out of them by teaching them all
mm,
the stuff we know.
yeah, yeah, and especially, I mean, there's a lot of cases of, you probably have knowledge of some of these children who remember past lives, who from the age of 2 or even younger, they start saying, I want to go see my other mommy in this other country or other city or whatever. And these have been investigated by psychiatrists and other types of investigators, and some of them have been able to match up the personality that the kid is talking about, their past personality, to an actual person who historically lived. And the kid will be able to give directions to the house and talk about, they'll meet relations that they used to have, relatives, and know about their work and how the person died, and all this other stuff. And that's really difficult to explain in scientific terms. Either it's being made up, or there really is reincarnation, or the kid is picking up some kind of psychic consciousness residue out in the universe that's totally unexplainable. But it's unusual stuff, and to my mind hasn't been, again, totally proven or totally disproven.
It's fascinating stuff. So